Bruno, per favore. Quanto tempo?
10 minuti,
10 minuti
a persona.
Grazie. Diciamo, avrei preferito cedere questo posto, insomma, dopo l'intervento di Galbraith. Siccome però sono, diciamo, abbastanza consonante con la parte conclusiva del suo intervento, o comunque mi interessa molto ragionare su quelle ipotesi, su quell'approfondimento, vorrei provare a dire attorno a un interrogativo: ma perché? Cioè, perché siamo di fronte ad una politica che è così manifestamente suicida e tuttavia non incontra alcuna correzione rilevante nelle locomotive dell'economia, della politica e delle istituzioni europee? Questa domanda secondo me è molto assillante. Insomma, gli effetti di questa politica hanno falsificato non solo il corpo teorico, come Galbraith spiegava, ma semplicemente gli input politici che un'intera classe dirigente, ormai credo si possa dire un'oligarchia, ha guidato questo processo in Europa. Appunto, la recessione si ripete ormai di anno in anno. La condizione di fuoriuscita da questa crisi non si affaccia minimamente, e coloro che anche prudentemente avevano individuato, diciamo, nel tunnel sono stati clamorosamente smentiti, erano altre luci, insomma, quelle che vedeva. Le diseguaglianze.
We're seeing some of the lights. The inequalities are very strong. They produce a social malaise, but also a dramatic crisis of social cohesion. And revolts, demonstrations are.
Dunque l'austerità produce da un lato recessione, dall'altro anche, diciamo, coloro che ci hanno lavorato.
The other, everyone recognized that we are confronted with dramatic data. Even the governor of the Italian Central Bank has said that at least 50% of income reduction is due to austerity policy, so recession and people getting poorer. So why are they continuing, and why are they continuing despite many scholars and many authoritative scholars move an objection? Now we have heard Professor Galbraith here. But, you know, there is a long line of Keynesian and new Keynesian supporters for a long time have criticized this approach. So how is that? I have the feeling that it's difficult to find an answer because we are misled by a couple of elements. The first one is the disappearance of policy or politics as the holder of viable projects. Since politics is suffering greatly, is in a very bad condition, it is as if we didn't have any political position. The second point is that since the social conflict is so deep that it seems we don't have it. So these two elements are the reasons why we cannot find answers. Politics has not disappeared, in fact, and social conflict or class conflict exists, but it has been reversed. It is not the workers fighting the ruling class, but it is the other way around. It's the ruling class fighting the workers, the working class. Because of this, we do not have an overall view of what is happening, which is unbearable. So this craziness has a rationale, which in the classical language of politics has a name: counter-reformation or counter-revolution. It's not just a set of mistakes made by the ruling classes. By contrast, it is a process which has its own rationale, that is the attempt to reply to the processes highlighted by Professor Galbraith in the first part, in the new laissez-faire phase, and in the second phase of Keynesian thought, and then the crisis which was transformed in Europe into a crisis of public debt and sovereign debt. It sounds like delusion, but as a matter of fact, there is a regression of economies and the production machinery, with losses, with sales, with different allocations, and the reorganization of strong chains, together with a mutation of the role of states, which over the past 25 years have incubated this changed role, and now it is taking shape. The national state devolves its powers not to a democratic supranational body, but to a technocratic oligarchic structure. It devolves its powers, and which becomes the policeman of public debt. The paradigm guiding this is exactly budget parity, so much so that we have it in our documents, and the fiscal compact. We have a real philosophy of the national state in this devolution towards the European suprastructure, which has a government that is taken away from popular sovereignty, starting from the European Central Bank, the weight of this body, and it is so different if we compare the other central banks, like the US Central Bank or the Japanese Central Bank. So if we talk of strong economies, I think this is misleading. In fact, we have to talk about Europe, because Europe is not Japan, and it is not even the US. Here, for the construction of this regressive Europe, we have a political organization that has mixed with this social and economic reorganization. And I close with a quotation. The president of the European Central Bank, one of the major intellectuals we have in Europe today, and that's why he's the president of the central bank. He's in the place where mainstream cultures are formed. Had the opportunity to say this, perhaps a bit cynical, but he said the European welfare state, as it was built in the so-called glorious 30 years, is not compatible with the new framework of competition that we have in the world. So the geopolitical change in the world is asking us to change. If we want to be competitive, we have to remove this incompatibility, strategic incompatibility, the European welfare system. This is the rationale. The austerity policies have an explanation. It's not pure folly. It's a way through which the social landscape is redesigned in Europe, the relationship between classes, the relationship between citizens and power. So it's a major operation. It's terrible, but it's an operation. It's not a trivial operation. It's an operation in which a new ruling class is working. That's why, in my opinion, the possible reply to this process is a reply that must include the two sides of the issue, not just one. Otherwise, it's not just a disarmed prophet. The topic of democracy and the topic of economy together, just like the ruling classes today keep them together within a regressive framework, since if you want to get rid of the welfare system, you cannot do it by consensus. What do? They build a form of government which is impermeable to consensus. So you go to the polls, but it's just useless because they have already decided what type of government. You know, there might be some change in the coalition, but not in terms of content. And quoting the intellectual I mentioned before, it's just automatic pilot. Whether you have a Monti government or a large coalition, it doesn't change. And even if Hollande goes to power, it's just the same, because this is the admitted concert. So we have the elites protecting a restructuring of the economy at the expenses of the poor. So it's a counter-revolution. So we should try and work against this. What's our leverage point? The leverage point is the issue of unemployment. Here we are in a place which was loved by Federico Caffè, and I have in mind the scandal of the thought of Federico Caffè compared to the present situation. Employment. How can we create jobs? What we hear every day is simply fastidious, annoying. Any person who has some critical mind, you just cannot hear this any longer. It's a mantra we can't put up with anymore. It's not acceptable intellectually and morally. Is it possible that someone really believes in what they say? You know, as they were telling us that through austerity we would get to recovery. Is there anyone who really believes that with these micro corrections we can have a policy for employment, up to the rhetorics that businesses will take care of it, when it's really clear that companies do not invest, not even their profits, as statistics tell us? And can we rely on demand when anyone sees that domestic demand is totally flat? It cannot even guarantee the survival of economy, not growth. Not even with growth would we be able to determine the employment levels we need. Just go figure. The demand is flat. External demand. But then they say we sell. Who are we selling to? Who are we selling to? Giulio Ciapelli a few days ago wrote something which is very convincing to me. Be careful. In the world, protectionisms are growing. Considering the present drama, people, also other countries, understand that, and BRICS countries, which were inside that kind of growth, since the crisis is hitting them as well, they want to protect themselves, and rightly so, and they are building some protectionist policies. But these protectionist policies, in a framework in which we have slacking demand and slacking private investment, we have an additional deflationary trend. So we understand very well that there is just one way out: public investment, no other way out. I understand it raises a huge problem, but we cannot go around it. Either we have a public investment, and to use another term, a socialization or investment, or this problem of employment is not tackled. We pretend we are tackling it. But once we say public investment, you go back to politics and democracy, because public investment is something versus fiscal parity, and versus European constraints and external constraints which rule over economy. Without an internal constraint, we are colonized by external constraints. The external constraint which is given by the European Central Bank, which strengthens a strong economic process. Yes. So if this is the case, the thing is, how do we get the force, either the prince or the revolt? Still Machiavelli, both the prince and the revolt, riots. So either the prince by Machiavelli, what Galbraith said, there is not just the alternative, either you are in the euro or you get out of the euro. There is a third way, which is the convergence of Mediterranean countries, which reopen a strong negotiation with Germany and with Europe, even jeopardizing the possibility of forming two different euros, one for the Mediterranean area. But first, a negotiation, which is the optimal solution. A second one is that of a movement from the bottom, and here again I refer to Galbraith, the idea of a social wage or a citizenship income, which is key. It is key. It is not the strategic answer to the problems of unemployment, but it is the introduction of that internal constraint which can give you the opportunity to discuss and to do something. Thank you.
Emiliano Brancaccio.
Emiliano Brancaccio. Thank you. Thank you for this invitation. I think we should place Professor Galbraith's talk within a conceptual framework. That is, that Professor Galbraith carries a tradition of critical thought that allows us to examine processes that, no doubt, the most traditional schools of thought, that is, mainstream thinkers, that is, austerity supporting people, and the fake Keynesians like Krugman are not able to offer. I don't know if you grasp this point, but perhaps Professor Galbraith's reasoning is a very harsh criticism also to Krugman, just to mention one. And this is very telling on how we are lagging behind if we think that Krugman is, for us, heretic. Professor Galbraith, with right reasons, tells us that that approach, that Krugman approach, is not enough to understand and to take action. So what are the elements that Professor Galbraith gives us, which are not given by the other schools of thought? These are structural elements, I would say. The structure of power relationships within the economic process. Professor Galbraith, in his arguments, gave us elements that were then summarized in a statement he made, reported in many writings of his. A statement by Professor Galbraith, which is important to me and which should be commented here at the Association for People's Banks, is the following. Galbraith wrote recently that the scale and the concentration of banks is inevitably concentration of power and subversion of the democratic state in the broad sense of the term. So a relationship between the processes of concentration of banks, concentration of power, and democratic processes, and conditions of survival of democratic processes. We might use a Marxian language. We might say that we're discussing centralization of capitals from a Marx perspective, and this topic is key for the situation of Eurozone and for the future destinies of the European Union. Why is it key? Because the crisis of the Eurozone is essentially a crisis due to a harsh clash between capitals, relatively strong capitals, mainly placed in the central countries of the European Union, and relatively weak capitals, mainly in the peripheral countries of the European Union. So a clash between capitals where labor is silent. And this silence might lead to a catastrophe. So this clash between the struggle between capitals can be analyzed on the basis of what the European Central Bank is doing, in the sense, and here Professor Galbraith helps us understand, the behavior of the European Central Bank is today justified to some extent in the light of mainstream theories, of the ruling theories. And I'll give you an example. Last March, just a few months ago, there was a crisis in Cyprus, which I'm afraid might be an example for the future. During the crisis in Cyprus, which again is not a special case, it can be very telling, well, it happened that the European Central Bank stepped in the political process, stating that within 48 hours it would freeze the extraordinary liquidity if the government did not accept immediately the recapitalization plan for banks, which was planned by the European Union, by the European institutions, and by the International Monetary Fund. In the absence of such an acceptance, the supply of liquidity would come to a halt within 48 hours. The theoretical justification given to that type of move was that the action of the central bank aims only at solving problems of liquidity, whereas the problems of creditworthiness are issues that are not up to monetary policy. This is one of the elements of the ruling theory, the dominating theory, that are basically accepted by the fake new Keynesians and by the austerity champions. So the central bank deals with the liquidity and not with creditworthiness. The contributions given by Professor Galbraith and other critical thinkers, we can infer that, by contrast, the European Central Bank has a very important role when it comes to determining the conditions of solvency of economic systems. For instance, the fact that this crisis, that is made worse by the present policies, create huge differences in the economic trends of different European countries, is an element causing also a difference in the conditions of solvency of the banking systems of the individual European countries, the banking systems of the European countries. And why is this important? Because if the European Central Bank follows the policies of the dominating theory, and if it states that it is ready to stop the supply of extraordinary liquidity unless restructuring is carried out according to this theory, this makes us think that the banking restructuring process might be a sort of Darwinian process, a process in which, following the words of Professor Galbraith, will have a concentration of banks that will inevitably result in a concentration of power and a subversion of the democratic process. I'm afraid that all the hopeful evocations that over the past months have come to surface around the term banking union, well, I'm afraid that all those hopes can be come to nothing, because a process of banking union might be just a pie in the sky. And I'm afraid that also as a result of the recent orientations of the European Central Bank, a disorderly banking restructuring and the Darwinian process is imposed. And if this is the case, we run the risk that we'll have to face either a total loss of control over the ownership of national banks in peripheral countries, or a detachment that implies very unpleasant consequences. So an attempt to maintain the ownership of banks at the national level, but with very unpleasant implications. And this is one of the aspects of this crisis, and this might be the key aspect that might lead us to a collapse of the political crisis in the Eurozone.
Grazie a tutti per la precisione.
Thank you very much for sticking to the time. Now Massimo Cingolani. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Asso Popolari and the Federico Caffè Study Center for the honor they gave me, inviting me to comment at the presentation by Professor James K. Galbraith. I think we have to thank James for the courage that during his career of economist has always made analysis against the grain or outside the beaten tracks, always inspired by critical sense. I think there are not many intellectuals who can boast the same approach in the West today. Of course, I talk on my personal behalf. I'm not talking here as representative of the European Bank for Investment. I just wanted to clarify this. So on my personal behalf, I'd like to make some points Also, as a result of my personal analysis, I've done also reading James' writings, but also Emiliano and Bruno. They have very complex problems. And it's difficult to untangle these issues, but some basic lines in the recent evolutions are, on the one side, what James said, the increase in inequalities. And also this is connected to distribution between income and rent. So we've had faked profits and financial profits versus wages. This creates a strong imbalance because private demand is slacking, is slow, because this distribution is at the expenses of wages. So I think this must be identified and possibly fixed. Second point, another long-term element. Over the past 20, 30 years, there has been an evolution in interest rates So interest rates have always been higher than economic growth. I don't want to enter the details of this argument, which is a bit technical, but here again there is a problem of distribution. That is, if the nominal interest rate is higher than the growth rate, of course we have more income to capital holders than to workers. So this makes imbalances stronger. Then a third point, which is very clear that we have seen in Europe, has been an increase in debt. But if you look data, you see that in all countries, perhaps with the exception of Germany, private debt has increased more rapidly than public debt over the past few years. So if there is one cause, if we say that the crisis must be found in debt, this must be found in a strong increase in private debt more than public debt. Of course, as a result of the crisis, public debt went up again. But let's put it this way, passively, to catch up with the events triggered by the crisis. So if we put together these three basic trends, and if we try and reason, as James done, outside the beaten tracks, I think it is important to leave the traditional pattern and to revise our conceptual tools. And if we take into consideration these three long-term phenomena, we might suggest a solution, a way out of the European crisis that is an other one on top of what of the solutions given by James. It's something in line with what Mr. Bertinotti said, the coordinated relaunch of the public, European public demand. Of course, to relaunch demand, you can have this just from the public sector, and this is a fact. Of course, we can discuss details. So I take this for a fact. The solution I'm trying to propose is that a coordinated relaunch of European public demand might generate a European public deficit, if it is appropriately devised, which might counterbalance the recession effect of fiscal constraints imposed by the Maastricht Treaty at the national level. The reason why I'm proposing this solution, and I'm a bit skeptical on the possibility on having a two-track Eurozone or a two-speed Eurozone, is because on the one side, in the tendency towards European integration, with the creation of the euro, the national power of currency creation is devolved at the central level. It was not done democratically, but that must be the process if you want to move towards an integrated Europe. So if we have this European power, of course, national states become some regions, and in no national state a region is free to create currency. It's always the central government that can create currency, money, and fund a deficit. So the lack of a European deficit that can counterbalance the centralization of the monetary policy. This is the first reason why I'm proposing the solution. And then the problems of budget into Europe derives from a difference of productivity, which are not fixed, are not corrected by a fragmentation of the European continent into regions, for instance, because in the two regions, in the two areas, the north and the south, whatever, the Mediterranean and the northern part, there will always be some parts at a very high productivity or with higher productivity and areas with lower productivity. And if we apply the same reasoning, we should define the local currencies at the municipal level, which is in fact the contrary of the idea of European integration. So to some extent, my argument is that we have moved forward up to a point. We have moved so far that we cannot go back. And the only way to fix the problem is to make a step towards the creation of a European deficit that, in my opinion, is possible through a coordination of domestic policies, taking into account that at the federal, European, continental level, we might consider that the interest rate is under the control of monetary authorities. It's an exogenous variable, and as such, it can be kept below the economic growth rate, so to correct the bias of income distribution, the one we've had in the last 20-30 years. So this is my comment on the interesting presentation by Professor Galbraith.